Hi, everybody, and happy Tuesday. I just had to delete my last video because as I was talking or reading, the little thing said bad connection and it ended up not recording like 10 minutes. So lucky for you. Anyway, a quick thank you to those of you that tried to join me today for my Google Meet. I had emailed all of you and invited you, but I forgot to click the little button that says join. Um, so we are going to schedule that for Thursday at 11 o'clock. Also, um, please check everything, your emails on a daily basis. I was getting text messages last night. Miss Machado, do we have work to do? Yes, every day. We now have to give you a homework agenda for either the week or by the day. I'm going to do it by the day. Um, so I was really late today because just a busy morning. I was at school. We had our staff meeting. Then I had to go get books for Montserrat, take them to Montserrat. Just kind of a crazy busy day. Um, and I'm getting very little feedback, you guys. So I don't know if you're watching things, if you like it, if it's a waste of time. Um, you do have work on Benchmark Advanced that I emailed you yesterday. You will need to open, there's two books, one with the actual story in it and another one that I've never assigned. The one that I never assigned, I can't think of the name of it, but it was one of the three things I sent you yesterday, and you have to open it. And then there's, I think it's like main idea. I added some, and you have to fill in the other box. In the actual story, you need to read it or you need to open it, and I put little post-its, little pink post-its in there with questions. So you click on those, it opens, and you have to answer the questions. I think I put 5, okay, but I don't get any feedback, so I don't know what you guys are seeing because I'm not a student. All right, so here we go. Chapter 6, and this one, oh, before I read this, remember, you guys may take AR tests on either Renaissance or on Epic. Okay, I'm checking those a couple of times a week. Um, and I apologize about my bad attitude yesterday. Just kind of over being in lockdown. I mean, I just miss everybody, and that was my journal writing yesterday that you guys were supposed to write. What do you miss? Um, and like I told you guys, I'm doing it also. Here's mine from yesterday. So gives me something to do also. All right, here we go. Tick, tick, tick. This reminds me of my dad. I was like looking at this crazy looking dude right here. Um, but it looks like the inside of a clock. All right, here we go. Professor Seabright could not sleep. He could not sleep and he did not know why, and this annoyed him. He was certainly tired. It had been a long day and he had walked a good deal in the hot sun. Past experience suggested that exercise, sun, and plenty of sea air during the day would usually ensure a very good night's sleep to follow, but not tonight, it seemed. He thought back to try to find some cause. Well, there had been that funny turn he'd had at lunchtime, but that had been quickly over, and he hadn't thought of it since. He had eaten nothing unusual at dinner and drunk no more, no less wine with it than usual, and he had come up to his room and to bed at the usual kind of hour. So he had expected to fall asleep at the usual time, too. He had changed into his nightwear and stacked his neatly folded clothes on a chair. The mattress had creaked a quiet hello to the weight of him, and he lay upon it, and the cold bedcloths had warmed their welcome. He had lain there in serene comfort and warmth and turned off the lamp and closed his eyes. But he could not sleep. Something was keeping him awake. Something like a gentle prodding finger. Tap, tapping. Inside his head. It was only the faintest noise, but in a steady rhythm. insistently repeating. He lay there a long time, semi conscious, still hazily confident that he could ignore it and soon drift off. But once half an hour had passed, he finally admitted to himself that sleep was well beyond him, and his senses roused themselves to try to identify the problem. The blurry sound came into focus. It was barely audible, and so it was difficult to identify. But in the quiet of the night, it stood out just clearly enough, and eventually he made himself sure. It was the ticking of a clock. How odd, he thought. He had not noticed the clock when he had checked into the room in the morning, and he had stayed in the same guest house countless times before, and there had never been a clock in any of the rooms. They were all they were all rather similar, so he could not be absolutely sure. But he thought he had even stayed in this very room on at least one previous occasion. Oh well, perhaps it was a new addition, or it had been here all along and he simply hadn't noticed it. It was close to silent. After all, a wonderful so it was a one so it was a wonderful hope maybe I need to change my glasses. So it was a wonder that he had noticed it now. But now that he had, he found himself unable to ignore it. He turned his bedside lamp back on and scanned around the room. He could not see a clock anywhere. No matter, now that he was awake, he might as well do something useful. He decided to take the opportunity to write up his notes. The dean of his university had an absurd idea that the professor had been working too hard and had insisted that he take some time off. So Professor Seabright was meant to be on a holiday, and he was mostly, but while he was here, he had taken the opportunity to visit the church in a nearby village. He was preparing a book on the subject of carvings in statues, kind of like statues that you're reading about in your benchmark book, and statuary in church architecture. And there was fine gargoyles to be found at St. Bragadoon's there that he had spent much of the day studying and sketching, so drawing in his notes a gargoyle. It had been most productive and fascinating visit, albeit that not wholly straightforward. The long walk there and the unseasonably hot sun had combined to make him rather weary by lunchtime. So when he'd reached the village pub on the way to the church, it had seemed like a good idea to stop in for refreshment, shade, and rest. When you get old, you have to take those breaks. I know, because Miss Rojas is old. It had been a sound enough idea in itself, but his choice of drink had proved unwise. The landlord had suggested devil's wallop, which is a drink, an ale that he brewed himself, and the professor had politely accepted his recommendation. It had turned out to be a well named brew of unusual darkness and strength, and the professor now found the interpretation of the notes and drawings made in the afternoon altogether a trickier task than transcribing his work from the morning. Meaning, he drank and now things are different. But still, it was a challenge he relished. And sitting up in the creaking bed, he had read and wrote and redrew very happily for 2 solid hours. He took particular delight in a drawing of one especially gruesome carving that he had seen, taking care to capture its hideous features exactly. Yawning once more, he set down his books on the bedside table and placed his glasses, on top, lay down and turned off the lamp. He smiled when he heard the ticking of the clock again. Absorbed in his work, he had entirely forgotten about it. But now, with an empty head and in dark silence, he registered again the faint beat of the second passing. Sleep would come soon enough, though he felt sure. Good Lord, I need more reading practice. He was wrong. A quarter hour passed, and then a quarter hour more, and he found himself still wide awake. There was, he felt, no good reason for this, and he was not fond of things that happened without good reason. The professor was an orderly man of fixed habits, and he never lay before, good Lord, sorry, fixed habits, and he had never before had trouble sleeping. What is more, he had a busy day planned tomorrow, and he would struggle with to cope with without first getting his usual 7.25 hours repose. And yet here he was in the dead of night, frustrated, as if sleeping was a skill that he had lost, as if he had simply forgotten how. And now that quiet ticking of the unseen clock seemed not so quiet. It seemed ridiculous to blame that one small noise for his sleeplessness, but he was a logical man and he could find no other cause. Therefore, he lifted his pillow, lay his head down upon the cool sheet beneath, and then clamped the pillow firmly over his unturned head. How it was that the ticking remained, even then. So he thought the ticking coming from like the wall, so he smothered his own head trying to cover the ticking noise. How it was that the ticking remained, even then clearly audible. He was at a loss to explain, but there it was, constant, insistent nagging. This was ridiculous. Professor Seabright's fingers clawed at the pillow, and an angry tension took hold of his whole body. With a rather embarrassing yelping cry, the professor hurled the pillow away. Though not very far, it was a feeble throw. Again, he turned the lamp on. He decided he must find the clock and stop it, or else remove it from the room. But locating it proved no simple task. No matter which way he turned, and no matter whereabouts in the room he stood, the ticking sound grew no louder, no fainter. This defied reason. And not only did his ears provide no useful clue to finding the mysterious clock, but his eyes could find no sight of it either. Clearly, then, it must be hidden from view. Ah, they're hiding the clock. Well, then, he would search until he found it. He began, as anyone who knew him even slightly would expect, in the methodical manner, starting in one corner and working along each of the walls in turn. He opened drawers and cupboards, scrutinized the contents of shelves inch by inch, looked even in the most unlikely locations. He went so far at one point as to move the lamp over to the fireplace and look up the chimney. Then, when he was back where he had begun, he looked under the bed. He looked in the bed. He opened up his own luggage and meticulously checked inside, though the contents of his bags and case were known to him by the last tiny item, and he knew full well, indeed, no timepiece, like no clock, nothing in there that should be going tick. And when, having searched everywhere, he still found nothing, he stood in the middle of the room and, with silent annoyance, noted how each quiet tick of the clock fall exactly between his short, fast, angry breaths. So as he's breathing, tick, tick. This was wrong. Professor Seabright checked over every possibility in his mind, scanned once, twice around the room, looking for some possible hiding place that he had not yet considered. Nothing. There was nothing he had missed. He was sure of it. There would be no point at all in looking again. It would be a waste of time and an insult to reason. He returned to his bed. He told himself he would sleep now, as a matter of principle, and he would sleep now. He would not allow himself to be kept awake by this nonsense. But he didn't lie down. He did not turn off the lamp, nor did he close his eyes or iron out the creases in his forehead. Crease. Trembling tension filled him. Professor Seabright was not, in the normal course of events, an emotional man, but if anyone had been able to see him now, they would probably have described him as seething, mad. Tick, tick, tick. The professor looked down at his right hand, clamped tightly around his upper part of his left arm, and found that the index finger of that hand was quiet without any conscious intention on his part, tapping against the sleeve of his nightshirt. Tapping in time with the infernal, unseen clock. Tick, 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 tap, 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 tick, tick. Now, sometimes when a man appears to have lived a calm life, ruled by reason, steady and measured in control, his placid exterior can actually conceal something quite different, meaning he looks great on the inside, but that's not always what's going on in the inside. That good old phrase, don't judge a book by its cover. Sometimes such a man holds within himself a bubbling well of madness and fury that, quite unseen, builds in pressure within him, awaiting its release. All it needs is a crack in that calm facade to allow the inevitable explosive outcome. That's me. Kind of really, really calm on the outside, but on inside, kind of like what I do with my mom and dad. Eek. 20 minutes later, standing with his back against the door, Professor Seabright surveyed the devastation strewn across the floor. Luckily, room 11, like all the rooms at the guest house, was quite sparsely furnished. There had been only one chair for the professor to fling angrily aside as he stamped toward the bookcase. The bookcase itself contained only a very few books, and none of any interest or value for him to scatter across the floor. So he's kind of like just tearing apart the room, looking for the clock. The few ornaments upon the mantelpiece had been cheap but surprisingly robust, all surviving the fall as they were swept onto the floor, and the sole piece of delicate chinaware had quite by chance landed unharmed upon the bed. Nevertheless, these few items, combined with the contents of the professor's luggage, the assorted fire irons, the shredded remains of the morning's newspaper, and sundry other items from around the room, had still created a considerable amount of mess when flung wildly about in frustrated rage. So he just went nuts and just crazy in the room. It was fortunate, though, that just as he had been deciding whether or not to tip over the writing desk, Professor Seabright had been interrupted by a knock at the door. The owner and manager of the guest house, Mr. Bolting, had not seemed particularly convinced by the professor's story about tripping over the night and stumbling into the chair. Oh, this all happened because I tripped. But tired as he had been willing to pretend that this adequately explained all the noise. He made no mention of the screaming and made no attempt to be let into the room to investigate further. He had always considered the professor eccentric, and he was suspicious of academics in general. But he guessed that whatever had just happened would not happen again, and if the damage was as bad as it had sounded, then the professor would pay suitable compensation without argument. Returning to his soft, warm bed seemed, in the circumstances, a much more welcoming prospect than attempting to uncover the truth of the matter. He shot the professor a dark look, tersely wished him a good night, and returned to his room. Meaning that the owner, he didn't want to go and investigate. Too much of a hassle. So if you told me by tripping you made this mess, then I'm going to believe you because I'd rather go back to my room and ignore what's happening. Professor Seabright's legs folded beneath him, his back slid down the door, and he crumpled into a tangled knot on the floor. He had managed to conjure a reasonable impression of normalcy while talking to Mr. Bolting, but it had been an effort. He made no such effort now that he was alone again. It felt as if he was losing the one thing most dear to him, his mind. The wild fury and abandon with which he had inflicted his clumsy violence on the contents of his room was unrecognizable to him now. It was as if they had been the actions of someone else entirely. He felt as if surely he had merely dreamed them, or that he was still dreaming them. Yet the mess upon the floor offered clear evidence of the contrary. In amongst the debris he spotted some shards of white crockery, the remains of fine china teacup. He felt himself to he felt himself to be just as broken. He sat upon the floor and shook. Tears came to his eyes, and as quietly as he could, he sobbed. The clock, my nose is like itching like crazy. The clock was still ticking, of course, insolently counting out the seconds, each stroke thumping in the professor's head. And now two other rhythms joined it. He had cut his left hand on one of the shards of the smashed teacup, and as he hugged his knees to his chest, drops of blood fell to the floor, just as tears dripped onto the fabrics of his nightshirt where it was stretched between his knees. The different rhythms of the three sounds fell in and out of the time with one another, mesmerizing Professor Seabright as he stared into the chaos of the scattered debris of the floor. I'm trying to speed read to try to keep this under 30 minutes. He picked up one of the notebooks, fallen open at the drawing of the gargoyle on which he had labored with such care earlier. The stone demon The stone demon returned the stare as the professor was reminded of his earlier visit to the church. Somewhat tired from the morning's long walk in the hot sun, further befuddled by the effects of the potent ale, the professor had been foolish to accept the vicar's eager invitation to climb the stairs to the clock tower. That's the guy that was giving him the tour of the churches. The tight, spiraling staircase had added dizziness to mild drunkenness, and he had emerged at the top of the tower, housing the impressive and ancient mechanism of the church clock, in a disoriented, rather alarmed state. The vicar had been prattling on, trying to inform him of the church's history, but Professor Seabright, in his distressed condition, had not taken in a word of it. He had felt dizzy and sick and panicked, and the stern iron beat of the clock had seemed to thud through him. So the professor climbed those stairs, and at the top, he wasn't feeling good. Flashback to when we talked about don't judge a book by its cover. So he's not feeling good inside. The Reverend had made him sit, and after only a moment or two, his breathing had steadied and he had felt calm again. In fact, he had soon forgotten about it entirely. But now, in room 11 of the guest house, that moment was back with him, and he could hear the ticking of the church clock again, shaking his bones, and the hidden clock, and the drip of blood, and the drip of tears. And his breath, another rhythm adding to the chaos. I can't read the word, so I made it up. And the beat of his heart, a further pulse, loud and relentless. Make it stop, he pleaded to the still night. Please make it stop. His vision began to blur and darken around the edges. The room receded into darkness, leaving only the notebook in light and focus. A dark blood stain blooming on the cover, growing from his cut hand. He could hear his heartbeat now above everything else, like a mighty drum. Could feel the shudder of it rattling through him, as if his heart was striking hard against the inside of his rib cage, with each fierce beat barging at it if eager for release. He shook and he trembled and he rocked. Please make it stop. And if the answer, and it, and it, as if in answer to this plea, all the noise ceased. The ticking and the dripping and the gasping sobs and the heartbeat too. The note